The entire boardroom laughed when Graham Hayes signed the resignation letter. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that fills a room and bounces off glass walls. Olivia Sterling stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, satisfaction written plainly across her face. She had finally removed the one man who knew too much. But 4 minutes later, the sound hit them before the sight did a jet engine close, growing louder. Every head turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. A private Gulfstream was descending onto the rooftop landing pad, and Graham Hayes was already walking toward it. Nobody at Sterling Aerospace could tell you exactly when Graham Hayes had arrived. That was the thing about him. He had always simply been there, moving through the glass corridors of the Chicago headquarters, like a man who belonged to the building rather than the company. He kept an office on the 14th floor, one floor below the executive suite, with a view of the freight-loading docks instead of Lake Michigan. He never complained about it. Most people assumed he had never thought to ask for better. His title was Senior Director of Operations, which was the kind of title that sounded important enough to print on a badge, but vague enough that no one at a dinner party would ask a follow-up question. In practice, Graham was the man the company called when something was quietly falling apart. A supplier chain collapsing 3 weeks before a government delivery deadline. A regulatory filing that had been mishandled by 2 departments simultaneously. A maintenance crew in Atlanta that had stopped showing up. Graham would board a commercial flight, always coach, and return 4 days later with the problem solved and no explanation anyone could follow. He wrote his reports in plain language, submitted them on time, and never asked for recognition. He drove a dark gray pickup truck from over a decade ago, the kind with rust along the wheel wells and a cracked dashboard mount where a phone holder had once been. He parked it in the general employee lot 3 rows from the entrance every single morning. He wore the same rotation of dark slacks and button-down shirts, nothing pressed particularly sharp, nothing worn out enough to comment on. He ate lunch at his desk most days, or sometimes at the diner across the street that served coffee in ceramic mugs and kept the same laminated menus for years. The waitress there knew his order without asking. The people who worked directly under Graham respected him without fully understanding why. He did not raise his voice. He did not take credit. When something went wrong on his watch, he said, "We," and meant it. And when something went right, he said, "the team," and also meant it. His assistant, a sharp woman named Diane, who had worked at the company for nearly 2 decades, once told a colleague that Graham was the only executive she had ever worked for who remembered her mother's name. Olivia Sterling did not remember anyone's mother's name. She had taken over Sterling Aerospace 14 months ago when her father, Richard Sterling, stepped down from the chairmanship, citing health reasons that the press was generous enough not to probe too deeply. The company had been in the Sterling family for over 40 years, built from a regional charter aviation service into a mid-sized aerospace contractor with government defense ties and a commercial maintenance division. Richard Sterling had been the kind of leader who built things slowly and kept his word, which made him respected, but not feared. Olivia was not interested in being respected. She wanted the company to be afraid of losing her. She was 34 years old, had an MBA from Wharton, and had spent 3 years at a private equity firm in New York before her father called her home. She was sharp in the ways that are visible quick in meetings, polished in front of cameras, decisive in language. The board of directors had approved her appointment with cautious optimism, the way you might approve a renovation plan that you are not entirely sure the contractor can execute. They wanted to believe she could do it. She wanted to prove she already had. The problem was that Olivia had inherited not just a company, but a company with problems. The Sterling Aerospace books were not fraudulent, but they were not clean either. Revenue had softened over the past 3 years as defense contracts dried up, and the commercial division struggled to compete with larger firms that had deeper maintenance networks. The margins were thinning in ways that would become visible to outside investors within 18 months if nothing changed. Olivia knew this. What she chose to do with that knowledge was the thing that would define everything that followed. Blake Donovan had come into her orbit at a conference in Washington, D.C., 9 months before any of this reached a crisis. He was a financial advisor who operated through a consulting firm with a deliberately unremarkable name, and he presented himself as a specialist in corporate restructuring for aerospace and defense companies. He was articulate, well-dressed, and had a way of making complicated financial maneuvers sound not only logical, but inevitable. He told Olivia that the company's best path forward was to bring in a focused group of private investors who would stabilize the balance sheet in exchange for a minority stake in the commercial division. He had the contacts. He had the structure ready. All she needed to do was make the case to the board. What Olivia did not fully see, or chose not to see, was that Blake's investor group had interests that did not align with the company's long-term health. The restructuring he was proposing was not designed to make Sterling Aerospace stronger. It was designed to make certain assets separable, easier to isolate, easier to move, easier to sell off in pieces if the larger structure eventually became inconvenient. But Blake presented everything in the language of growth and stability, and Olivia was under enough pressure from the board that the language landed exactly where he intended it to. Graham Hayes noticed the discrepancy in the financial models before anyone else. He was not looking for it. He had been reviewing operational cost projections for the Fort Worth maintenance facility when he cross-referenced a revenue forecast that did not match the contracts he knew were in place. The numbers had been adjusted, not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger a standard audit flag, but adjusted in a direction that made the commercial division look more distressed than it actually was. A company in distress could justify emergency restructuring. Emergency restructuring could justify bringing in outside investors on terms that a healthy company would never accept. He went back through 6 months of internal reports. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. Someone had been quietly reshaping the financial picture of Sterling Aerospace, not to steal from it yet, but to set the conditions under which theft would become structurally possible. Graham compiled everything he found into a single document, organized it carefully, and requested a private meeting with Olivia Sterling. She gave him 30 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, fitting him in between a call with a government procurement officer and a dinner with a potential board member. Graham arrived with a printed copy of his findings and a USB drive with the underlying data. He set both on her desk without preamble. Olivia looked at the materials for approximately 90 seconds, then looked at him. "Where did you get these projections?" she asked. Graham explained that they had come from the internal forecasting system, cross-referenced with contract records he had access to through his operational role. He explained what the discrepancy suggested and what it would mean for the board's upcoming decision on the investor restructuring proposal. He was direct and specific and did not editorialize. He simply told her what he had found. Olivia did not thank him. She asked him to leave the materials with her and said she would look into it. Her expression was the careful kind, the kind that gives nothing away while processing information at high speed. Graham left the office. He believed at that point that he had done the right thing and that the matter would be handled appropriately. He was wrong about what Olivia would do next, but he was not surprised when he found out. Within 48 hours of that meeting, Blake Donovan had been informed that an internal operations director had raised concerns about the financial restructuring data. Blake moved quickly. He told Olivia that Graham Hayes was not a concerned employee. He was a destabilizing presence who had been building a case against her leadership for months. He suggested that Graham's real motive was to undermine the restructuring deal in order to position himself as the person who had saved the company, which would give him leverage over the board. He framed Graham's findings not as evidence, but as strategy. And he framed Graham not as a whistleblower, but as a rival. Olivia had been running on thin sleep and thinner patience for 14 months. The board was watching her every move. The restructuring deal was the centerpiece of her first-year plan, and if it collapsed under internal scrutiny before it even reached a vote, the narrative would not be kind to her. She made a decision that had more to do with control than with facts, and she made it quickly. Graham received a calendar invitation 3 days later for what was listed as a routine leadership alignment session. He arrived at the executive conference room on the 15th floor to find the entire senior leadership team assembled, 12 people in total, along with Blake Donovan, who sat at the far end of the table, as though he had always had a seat there. Olivia stood at the front. She had dressed more formally than usual, which Graham noticed in the way you notice small strategic choices when you have been in enough rooms like this one. She began with a prepared statement about organizational direction and leadership accountability, the kind of language that sounds neutral until it becomes specific. When it became specific about Graham Hayes. She said that the operations division had shown a pattern of overreach of individuals exceeding their designated scope in ways that created confusion and undermined strategic initiatives. She said this without looking directly at Graham. Then she said that the company needed to move forward with clarity of vision and that certain leadership transitions were necessary to achieve that clarity. One of the junior directors near the door shifted in his seat. Another person looked at the table. The room had the particular stillness of people who know something uncomfortable is happening and have decided not to be the one to name it. Graham did not speak. He listened until Olivia finished, and then he asked one question. He asked whether any of the financial data he had submitted 3 days ago would be reviewed by an independent party before the board vote on the restructuring proposal. Olivia said that all relevant materials were being handled through appropriate channels. It was a sentence designed to mean nothing while sounding like a complete answer. Graham nodded once. He reached into the folder he had brought with him and removed a single sheet of paper, the resignation letter that had been placed in the folder by Olivia's administrative team. He realized now, because someone had expected exactly this outcome and prepared accordingly. He read it quickly, pulled a pen from his shirt pocket, and signed it at the bottom of the page. He slid it across the table toward Olivia without a word. The room exhaled. Someone near the back of the table actually laughed, a short, involuntary sound, quickly suppressed. But then Blake Donovan laughed with more confidence, the kind of laugh that gives permission to a room, and 3 other people followed. Olivia allowed herself a small, composed smile. 14 months of maneuvering had led to this exact moment, and the man she had moved the most pieces to remove had simply handed her what she wanted. Graham stood, buttoned his jacket, and said one thing before he walked out. He said, "Good luck with the vote." Nobody knew exactly what to do with that sentence, so they left it where it landed. He walked out of the conference room, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and spent 11 minutes at his desk. He sent 3 emails, brief administrative nothing that looked like a goodbye to anyone who might scan them later. He left the office with the same canvas bag he arrived with every morning. He did not stop to talk to anyone. Diane watched him walk past her desk and said nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The rooftop of the Sterling Aerospace building had been designed as a landing pad in the building's original construction, a specification from the late 1980s, when the founder had believed that urban air mobility would reshape Chicago within a decade. It had never been used for that purpose. It had become over the years a maintenance platform for the HVAC units and a place where facilities staff occasionally took a break between floors. There was no reason for anyone in the 15th floor boardroom to be watching it, which is why no one saw the Gulf Stream until its engine noise made the glass walls vibrate. The jet came in low from the north, banking smoothly over the river, and set down on the building's rooftop with the kind of precision that requires both an exceptionally capable aircraft and an exceptionally capable pilot. The Sterling Aerospace boardroom had a direct sightline to the pad, and every person in that room was now standing at the windows. Graham Hayes crossed the rooftop in a straight line. His jacket still buttoned the canvas bag over one shoulder. A member of the aircraft's ground crew met him at the stairs. They exchanged a few words that no one in the boardroom could hear. Graham walked up the stairs without hurrying, ducked through the jet's door, and the ground crew sealed it behind him. The Gulf Stream lifted off the rooftop with the same controlled ease with which it had landed and turned south over the city, climbing smoothly until it was a white shape against the gray, late afternoon sky, then nothing at all. Olivia Sterling stood at the window with her hands flat against the glass and said nothing. Blake Donovan, standing 2 feet behind her, said nothing either. The rest of the room was also silent, but it was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes not from respect, but from the sudden and disorienting awareness that you have badly misread a situation and cannot yet calculate the cost. The Gulfstream was a G650, a detail that one of the junior directors would later confirm by pulling up the tail registration on his phone. The aircraft had a market value north of $65 million. It was registered to a holding company with a name that meant nothing to anyone in that room. But it had landed on their building, on a pad that had been filed with the city as an active landing site 18 months ago by a legal entity no one at Sterling Aerospace had ever questioned, and it had taken Graham Hayes away like a man who had always known exactly where he was going. Olivia turned away from the window and looked at Blake. The question on her face was not a simple one, and Blake, for the first time since she had known him, did not have a ready answer. The holding company that owned the Gulfstream had a name, Vantage Meridian Holdings. That was all anyone could find. Olivia's legal team spent 4 days on it before coming back with a 2-page memo that essentially said the same thing in different ways. The ownership structure was legitimate, properly filed, and deliberately opaque, in ways that were entirely legal and entirely impenetrable, without a court order, for which there was no probable cause. The attorneys advised her to stop pulling at the thread. She told them to keep pulling. The second thread led to a private equity subsidiary registered in Delaware, which connected to a real estate trust in Nevada, which connected back to Vantage Meridian. The structure was circular in the way that expensive legal engineering tends to be, not hiding anything exactly, just making the path to the center long enough that most people gave up. Blake had people make calls to 2 law firms and a compliance consultant, all of whom reported back with variations of the same conclusion. Whoever had constructed this network had done it over many years and with considerable resources, and they had done it well before anyone at Sterling Aerospace had reason to care. Blake told Olivia to stop the investigation. He said it calmly, and with what sounded like strategic reasoning. Drawing attention to the inquiry would signal to the board that something unusual had happened with Graham's departure, and that was the last thing she needed before the restructuring vote. Olivia listened to him. She filed the memo and moved on to other things, but she kept a copy of the memo in the top drawer of her desk, and she looked at it sometimes in a way she couldn't fully explain. Meanwhile, at 3 separate financial institutions, a series of debt acquisition transactions were processed over the course of 2 weeks. The transactions were routed through an investment vehicle called Caraway Capital, a name that appeared in no press releases and had no public-facing website. Caraway Capital had been quietly active in the aerospace and defense sector for nearly 7 years, accumulating positions in companies that were strategically positioned, but financially stressed, the kind of companies that needed a patient invisible hand rather than a loud one. Its founding documents listed a single individual as the original managing partner. That individual was a woman named Margaret Hayes, who had died of cancer 3 years prior. The debts Caraway Capital was now purchasing were not random. They were specific instruments, vendor financing agreements, deferred maintenance contracts, and 2 convertible notes issued by Sterling Aerospace to mid-tier suppliers during the revenue softness of the previous 2 years. Individually, they were unremarkable. Together, they represented leverage over a significant portion of the company's operational continuity. If those instruments were ever called due simultaneously, the disruption would not be survivable without outside intervention. The person who now controlled them could at the right moment determine whether the company lived or was dismantled. None of this information reached Olivia through Blake. Blake had his own sources monitoring the debt markets, and when Caraway Capital's activity was flagged to him, he made a decision not to share it with Olivia directly. Instead, He told her something simpler and more useful to his own position, that Graham Hayes had not accepted the resignation quietly, that he was making moves in the background, that his goal was to destabilize the company so completely that the board would have no choice but to accept outside intervention, specifically intervention from Graham himself or entities aligned with him. Blake called it a long game and said Graham had been playing it for years. He said the quiet, unremarkable man Olivia had fired was not what he appeared to be, and that the fact he had walked away so easily should be the most alarming thing of all. Olivia absorbed this. It did not fully convince her, but it did something more useful to Blake. It kept her off balance, slightly afraid of the wrong thing, and dependent on him for context she could not independently verify. 3 weeks after the resignation, Olivia received a piece of information from an unexpected source. One of her outside board members, a woman named Patricia Wells, who had spent 30 years in commercial aviation, called her on a Saturday morning and asked a question that sounded casual and was not. She asked whether Olivia was familiar with a logistics company called Horizon Air Systems. Olivia said she had heard the name but didn't have strong familiarity with it. Patricia said that was interesting and changed the subject, and the conversation ended pleasantly without resolving anything. Olivia searched the name the moment she hung up. Horizon Air Systems was a privately held aerospace logistics company with no public profile to speak of, but its operational footprint was substantial. It managed supply chain coordination for 6 major commercial carriers and 3 regional freight operators, controlling the flow of parts, maintenance materials, and ground support equipment across dozens of hubs. In the industry, it was known as the company that kept other companies running the kind of infrastructure that became visible only when it stopped working. Its ownership was not publicly disclosed. It had never sought outside investment, never issued a press release, and never appeared in any industry awards list or conference speaking roster. It was, in short, a company that had been built specifically to be indispensable without being prominent. Olivia could not confirm who owned it. But Patricia's question had not been random, and the timing relative to Graham Hayes' departure was not something Olivia was willing to dismiss. She decided to find out directly. A contact in the private aviation community told her that a man matching Graham's description had been seen at a fixed-base operator terminal at DuPage Airport on 2 occasions in the past 10 days. DuPage was a private aviation hub 40 miles west of Chicago, quiet enough to avoid scrutiny and large enough to accommodate international arrivals without drawing attention. Olivia drove there herself on a Tuesday afternoon, told no one where she was going, and arrived 90 minutes before the second confirmed sighting time. She waited in a rental car in the facility parking area with a direct view of the terminal. The waiting was difficult. She was not a person built for sitting still with uncertainty, and for over an hour there was nothing to see but ground crew moving equipment and a small turboprop departing for what looked like a regional hop. Then a black SUV arrived at the far end of the tarmac, and she recognized Graham Hayes before he even stepped fully out of the vehicle. He was dressed the same as he always had been, dark slacks, a simple jacket. He shook hands with the driver and walked toward the terminal without looking around, the way people move when they are comfortable in a place and have been there many times. Olivia watched from the car as 3 other vehicles arrived over the next 15 minutes. The men who stepped out of them were not people she recognized immediately, but she pulled up photographs on her phone with the partial plate numbers she caught, and by the time she drove back to Chicago, she had identified 2 of them. One was a managing director at a sovereign wealth fund based in Abu Dhabi that held positions in multiple global aerospace companies. The other was a former deputy undersecretary in the Department of Defense who had transitioned to private advisory work after his government tenure. The third man she was not able to identify that day, but she remembered his face. What Olivia did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that a Horizon Air Systems security contractor had flagged her rental car's plate within 8 minutes of her pulling into the lot. The terminal was one of 4 facilities that Horizon used for sensitive logistics coordination, and monitoring the surrounding access points was standard procedure. Graham had been informed of her presence before she had even finished adjusting her mirrors. She did not tell Blake what she had seen. This was the first decision she made entirely without him in weeks, and she noticed the feeling of it, a small, cold clarity that she had not felt since before she had started taking his calls. The board meeting to vote on Blake's restructuring proposal was scheduled for 11 days out. The plan had been Olivia's flagship initiative, the thing she had staked her first-year credibility on, and it was now the thing she was most afraid of. Because she had spent 3 days after the DuPage visit going back through Blake's financial models with a lens she had not used before, not the lens of a CEO trying to find a path forward, but the lens of someone trying to find what was being hidden. The discrepancies Graham had identified in his original memo were still there unchanged because no one had corrected them. The direction they pointed had not changed either. She called her CFO a careful man named Robert Adkins and asked him to run an independent reconciliation of the commercial division revenue forecasts against the actual contract values in the system. She told him to do it quietly and not to share the findings with anyone until he shared them with her. Robert called back 26 hours later with a voice that was professional and tightly controlled, which told her everything before he said a word. The numbers Graham had flagged were accurate. The forecasts Blake had been using to justify emergency restructuring terms were based on figures that did not match the company's actual financial position. Sterling Aerospace was stressed, but it was not as distressed as the proposal required it to appear. Olivia sat at her desk after that call for a long time. The top drawer was still closed, and the memo about Vantage Meridian Holdings was still inside it. She tried to reach Graham Hayes through every channel she had. She called the number she had for him from the company directory, which had been disconnected. She had her assistant search for any alternate contact and found nothing. She sent a message through the company's former HR system to an email that may or may not have still been active. She did not receive a response. Graham Hayes had left the building in every sense and had apparently taken any accessible version of himself with him. The financial crisis accelerated faster than anyone had predicted publicly. A vendor financing agreement came due at an inconvenient time and could not be quietly rolled over as it had been twice before. The credit agency downgrade followed within 48 hours, which was the kind of sequence that looks random to outsiders and looks inevitable to anyone who understands how these structures are designed to collapse. Sterling Aerospace's stock dropped 19% over 3 trading sessions. 3 board members called Olivia directly. The calls were polite in the way that very serious warnings are delivered politely. Blake arrived at her office on the 3rd morning of the stock decline and sat down without being invited. He was calm in a way that no one with genuine concern for the situation would be calm, and Olivia noticed it now in a way she would not have noticed 2 weeks ago. He told her the restructuring vote needed to happen on schedule. He said the investor group he had assembled was prepared to move quickly and that any delay would make the terms worse. He said that the current crisis was being driven by external market conditions, a phrase she recognized as meaningless, and that the restructuring was the only available path to stabilization. He said all of this with the smooth competence of a man who had said it many times before in many different rooms. When he left, Olivia opened the top drawer. She spent 2 hours that evening reviewing everything she had. The original memo from Graham Roberts' reconciliation, the investor group documentation Blake had shared with her over the past 9 months, and every email chain between them that she could access. The picture that assembled itself was not complicated. It was in fact quite simple, which was the most frightening thing about it. The restructuring was designed to transfer a significant portion of Sterling Aerospace's most valuable assets, the defense maintenance contracts and the proprietary component supply agreements, to entities that were controlled through several layers by the same holding structure that Blake's investor group operated under. The public announcement would describe it as a recapitalization. What it actually was a controlled stripping of the company's core value, executed under the cover of a crisis that had been carefully shaped to justify it. Blake did not intend to be there when the full consequences became clear. That much was evident from the structure of his own advisory agreement, which contained a performance clause that would pay out in full upon completion of the restructuring transaction, regardless of subsequent company performance. He had designed his exit before he had finished designing the entry. Olivia made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to Robert Adkins, asking him to prepare a full independent audit request that could be submitted to the board. The second was to Patricia Wells, who listened without interrupting and said only that she had been waiting for this call. The third was to a number associated with Caraway Capital that she had tracked down through the debt acquisition filings. The number rang 6 times and transferred to a voicemail that offered no name, only a prompt. Olivia left a message that was direct and brief. She said she needed to speak with whoever controlled the Caraway Capital position in Sterling Aerospace. She said she understood the situation better than she had 4 weeks ago. She said she was asking for a conversation, not a favor. She did not receive a call back. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, a timing that Blake had suggested months ago and that now felt like a detail she should have questioned. The agenda had been set to include a formal vote on the restructuring proposal, along with a review of the company's response to its recent credit events. 72 hours before the meeting, Blake filed a supplemental disclosure with the board that cited an internal compliance concern related to Olivia's handling of certain financial communications. The disclosure was precise, legalistic, and based on documentation that Olivia had never seen before. Some of it appeared to be genuine internal correspondence excerpted out of context. Some of it appeared to be something else. Together, it was enough to trigger a mandatory internal review process that, under the company's governance rules, placed her operational authority in a provisional status, pending board evaluation. She could still attend the shareholder meeting. She could still speak. But she could not vote, could not authorize transactions, and could not unilaterally block the restructuring proposal from reaching a floor vote. In the span of one filing, Blake had effectively frozen her in place at exactly the moment when movement was the only thing that could help her. Robert Adkins called her the morning of the meeting and told her that 2 of the board members, who had previously been sympathetic, had shifted their position overnight. He did not know why. She did not ask him to find out because she already understood what had happened. Blake had been managing the board relationships she thought were hers, and he had been managing them longer than she had been paying attention. She arrived at the shareholder meeting alone. Her attorney was present, but seated at the back of the room, available for consultation, but not permitted to participate in the proceedings. Blake sat on the left side of the governance table with the investor group. Representatives, 4 men in dark suits, who had flown in from 2 different cities, and who looked at the room with the patience of people who expected to leave, having gotten what they came for. The board members were in their assigned seats. The general shareholders were arranged in the main body of the room, most of them watching the front, with the particular anxiety of people who have been told a meeting is routine, and suspect it is not. Olivia sat at the head of the table because it was still her chair provisionally, technically for the next 2 hours. She looked at the room and understood with complete clarity that there was no version of the next 2 hours in which she won on her own. The documentation she had prepared with Robert was not enough without the board votes to act on it. The board votes were not there. Blake had moved the pieces while she had been looking for Graham Hayes, and Graham Hayes had not called her back. The board chair, a man named Howard Gill, opened the meeting with the procedural language that precedes consequential decisions and gave the evening's agenda its false shape of normalcy. Howard announced the first item of business, which was the restructuring vote, and invited opening remarks. Blake was already leaning forward in his chair, already organized, already ahead of everyone in the room by exactly the number of moves he had planned for. The door at the back of the room opened. Howard did not stop his sentence immediately, but his eyes moved to the door, and then the rest of the room's eyes followed his. And then Howard did stop, because the man who had just walked in was carrying a document case and moving toward the front of the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who had arrived exactly when he intended to, and not a moment before. Graham Hayes set the document case on the table, looked at Blake Donovan once, and then looked at Howard Gill. He said that he had materials relevant to the vote and requested the floor. His voice was level and unremarkable, the same voice he had used in every operations meeting for years. Howard, who had known Graham for nearly a decade before this evening, looked briefly at Blake, and then looked back at Graham and said that the floor was open. Blake's expression did not change, but his hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to his lap. Olivia looked at Graham. Graham did not look at her. He opened the document case, arranged 3 stacks of printed material in front of him, and began to speak. He was not there to save her. That was clear from the first sentence. He was there because there were thousands of people employed by Sterling Aerospace, and someone needed to decide before this meeting ended what kind of company they would wake up to tomorrow morning. Graham spoke for 22 minutes without interruption. He did not raise his voice. He did not use language designed to humiliate anyone in the room, though the material he presented would have justified it. He worked through the documents methodically, the original financial discrepancies he had flagged approximately 7 weeks ago. The independent reconciliation Robert Adkins had since completed the debt acquisition trail through Caraway Capital that intersected with the Vantage Meridian structure, and finally, the piece that no one in the room had seen before, a parallel set of communications between Blake Donovan and 2 members of the investor group that documented in their own words the intended sequence of asset transfers that would follow the restructuring vote. The communications had been obtained legally through a process Graham did not elaborate on, and they were dated across a 14-month period, meaning they predated Olivia's tenure as CEO by 2 months. The investor group's 4 representatives who had arrived expecting a procedural vote were now very still in their seats. Blake did not look at the documents Graham distributed. He looked at the table in front of him with an expression that had stopped being readable, which was the expression of a man calculating rather than feeling, running numbers on outcomes rather than responding to events. When Graham finished speaking, and Howard Gill asked if there were any challenges to the materials presented, Blake said nothing. His attorney, who had been seated against the wall behind him, leaned forward and touched his shoulder and said something quietly. Blake shook his head once. Howard called a 5-minute recess. He did not return in 5 minutes. He returned in 18, and when he came back into the room, he was accompanied by 2 men in dark coats who had entered the building through the side entrance. One of them showed credentials to the room. The other walked directly to Blake Donovan and said his name and asked him to stand. Blake stood. He did not say anything dramatic. He straightened his jacket, which was an odd reflex, and walked with the 2 men toward the exit without looking back at the table. The 4 investor representatives were asked to remain in the building for further conversation. Their attorney was already on his phone before the door closed. The room was silent in the way that large rooms go silent when something irreversible has just happened in them. Olivia did not move. She was watching Graham, who had closed the document case and was standing at the table with no particular expression. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the vindicated energy of a man who has just won something. He looked, if anything, tired in the way that people look tired when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally been allowed to set it down. Howard Gill returned to the front of the room and addressed the shareholders directly. He said that the restructuring vote was being suspended, pending a full independent audit and a review of the governance procedures that had led to its current form. He said that the board would convene an emergency session within 72 hours to determine the company's operational path forward. He said these things in the measured language of institutional authority, the language designed to restore the appearance of order to a room that had just watched order dissolve in real time. When Howard finished, He looked at Graham and said that the board was grateful for the materials provided and would need to schedule a formal deposition. Graham said that was fine. Howard then looked at Olivia and said carefully that the provisional status on her operational authority would remain in effect pending the board's emergency session, but that the compliance disclosure filed by Blake Donovan would itself now be subject to review, given what had come to light this evening. Olivia nodded. It was all she could do. The room cleared gradually in the cautious way people leave a space where something consequential has happened. Not rushing, not lingering, just moving with the careful awareness of people who want to process what they witnessed before they are asked to describe it. The shareholder group filtered out first, then the investor representatives with their escorts, then the board members in pairs, speaking quietly among themselves. Robert Adkins caught Olivia's eye on his way out and gave her a small, deliberate nod that meant something she would think about later. Graham was the last to gather his materials. He closed the document case, lifted it from the table, and turned toward the exit. He had crossed half the distance to the door when Olivia said his name. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his face held the neutral patience of a man who had anticipated this moment and had not decided yet what to do with it. Olivia had not prepared a speech. She was a person who was almost always prepared, who rehearsed important conversations in advance and anticipated responses, and had contingency language ready for the turns a dialogue might take. She had none of that now. She was standing at the head of a table in a room that smelled like recycled air and coffee, with the wreckage of her first year as CEO arranged around her in neat stacks of printed evidence, and the only honest thing she had available was the truth of how the evening had arrived at this point. She said that she owed him an acknowledgement. She said that when he had come to her office 7 weeks ago with the financial data, she had a choice, and she had made the wrong one. She said she had known on some level that what he was showing her was real, and that she had chosen to hear Blake's version instead because it was more convenient for what she was trying to do. She said this without qualification or redirection. She did not mention the pressure she had been under, or the board's expectations, or the difficulty of inheriting a company mid-crisis. She said she had made the wrong call, and that the people who worked for the company had come close to paying for it in ways that had nothing to do with them. Graham listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that signals thought rather than avoidance. He said that he had known about the financial irregularities before he brought the memo to her office. He said he had, in fact, identified the pattern almost 4 months before that meeting, and that he had spent those 4 months trying to determine whether Olivia was complicit in it or simply being managed by someone who was better at this than she was. He said the DuPage meeting she had witnessed, the one she thought she had attended undetected, he had known she was there within 10 minutes of her arrival. He said he had allowed it because he needed to understand what she would do with the information, and that what she had done, going to Robert Adkins, attempting to reach Caraway Capital, not sharing what she had seen with Blake, had told him what he needed to know. Olivia absorbed this in silence. The idea that she had been assessed quietly from a distance by a man she had dismissed as a subordinate was not comfortable. But she recognized that it was exactly the kind of careful, patient move that Graham Hayes had been making throughout his entire time at the company, and that she had never once looked for it. She asked him what he was going to do with the Caraway Capital position, the debt instruments that gave him structural leverage over the company's operational continuity. The question was direct, because there was no longer any point in being indirect. Graham said that the instruments would be restructured on terms favorable to the company's long-term stability. He said the details would go through the board and would be fully disclosed in the audit. He said that Caraway Capital had no interest in dismantling Sterling Aerospace. It had never had that interest. It had accumulated those positions specifically to prevent someone else from using them as a demolition tool, which was the scenario that had been quietly building for the past 1.5 years. He said that Margaret, his wife, had built Caraway's original framework to protect companies. Like this one, companies were the work that kept planes in the air was being treated as an asset to be stripped rather than a function to be sustained, and that he had continued it in her name because he did not know a better reason to continue anything. It was the only time all evening that his voice changed in a way that was not about the material he was presenting. Olivia did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked about Horizon Air Systems, the name Patricia Wells had given her weeks ago, the company whose ownership she had never been able to confirm. She asked it plainly, without framing it as an accusation, because she already understood that framing things as accusations with Graham Hayes was a strategy that had a poor track record. Graham said that Horizon was his. He said he had built it over 9 years alongside Margaret, starting with 2 logistics contracts and a leased warehouse in Indianapolis, and that it had grown into something neither of them had originally planned for, but that both of them had understood was necessary. He said that Horizon and Caraway had been designed to work in parallel, one controlling the operational supply chain that companies like Sterling depended on, the other holding the financial instruments that determined their structural survival. Together, they formed a position that could either protect a company or dismantle it, depending on who was in control and what they chose to do. He said the point had never been to use that position aggressively. The point had been to ensure that someone with different intentions could not use a similar position against the people who actually did the work. Olivia looked at him and understood for the first time the full architecture of what she had been standing inside without knowing it. Graham had not been a mid-level operations director who happened to have a private jet. He had been the structural foundation beneath a company that had no idea he was there, holding weight that would have collapsed everything if he had simply walked away and left it unsupported. She asked why he had worked at the company as an operations director for 7 years, without anyone knowing what he actually controlled. He could have sat on the board. He could have led the company formally with his name on the door. He had the resources and the track record. Why had he spent 7 years parking a decade-old pickup truck in the general employee lot and spending his lunch hours at a diner with laminated menus and ceramic coffee cups? Graham considered this question with the same attention he had given the financial documents earlier in the evening. He said that the work he found meaningful was the operational work, the actual function of keeping complex systems running, solving real problems with real consequences, being the person who knew where the freight delays were and how to fix them before they cascaded. He said that titles and offices were not the reason he showed up. He said that he had learned over time that the further a person moved from the actual work into the language of the work, the more their decisions tended to be made for the wrong reasons, and that he had no interest in being that person. He said Margaret had understood this about him before he had fully understood it himself. Olivia looked at him and thought about the 14 months she had spent trying to prove something to a board of directors in a building her father had built, and she understood that she and Graham Hayes had been working from entirely different definitions of what leadership was supposed to produce. She asked what came next, not strategically, not procedurally, just what he thought came next. Graham said that the board's emergency session would determine the formal path. He said that the provisional status on her authority was likely to be resolved quickly once the Blake-related compliance filing was invalidated, which it would be. He said the audit would take 60 to 90 days, and that the company's credit position would stabilize once the debt instruments were restructured. He said the structural damage was recoverable. He said all of this in the practical, sequential way he organized every complex problem. Then he said one more thing. He said that the board would probably offer to restore her full CEO authority once the audit cleared, and that before she accepted, she should spend some time in the operations she oversaw rather than the reports she received about them. He said it without condescension, the way you say a thing when you mean it practically, and not as a judgment. He said that the company's real value was not in the contracts or the stock price. It was in the maintenance crews and the logistics coordinators and the supply chain managers who kept aircraft functional and safe, and that a CEO who understood that from the inside rather than from a financial model, was a different kind of leader than one who did not. He picked up the document case and walked out. Olivia stood in the empty conference room for several minutes after he left. Outside the windows, Chicago was lit and indifferent, the city going about its evening with no awareness of what had just been decided inside this building. She thought about the Gulf Stream lifting off the rooftop 7 weeks ago, and about the moment she had stood at the glass, with her hands pressed flat against it, watching a man she had believed she understood disappear into the sky. She had been certain, in that moment, that she was watching someone who had lost. She had been that wrong about that many things in the same instant, which was a specific kind of humiliation that did not diminish with time. The board's emergency session took place 68 hours later. The Blake Donovan compliance filing was formally invalidated. The internal review was closed. Olivia's provisional operational status was lifted, and full authority was restored. The board offered her a clean confirmation for the next fiscal year's leadership cycle. She accepted, and then she made one additional request that the board had not anticipated. She asked for a 60-day operational immersion assignment in the company's field divisions, beginning immediately before she resumed full executive duties. She specified that she wanted to be assigned to actual operational teams: maintenance, scheduling, supply chain coordination, vendor management, not in an oversight capacity, but in a working one. She said she wanted to understand what the company actually did before she made another strategic decision about how it should do it. Howard Gill looked at her across the table with an expression that was difficult to read, and then said that the board would support the request. She started in Fort Worth. The maintenance facility outside Fort Worth handled heavy airframe work for 3 regional carriers and 2 cargo operators, and it ran on a schedule that began before sunrise and did not stop for the kind of reasons that executive offices stop for. The crew chiefs did not adjust their communication style for Olivia's presence, which she had specifically requested, and which took some adjustment on her part to navigate without the interpretive layer she had always had between herself and the people doing the actual work. She spent the first week making mistakes that were corrected without comment, and the second week making fewer of them. By the 5th week, she could read a maintenance log and understand what it was actually telling her, not just the summary, but the sequence of decisions embedded in it, the judgment calls that never appeared in the formal record, the institutional knowledge that lived in the crew chief's hands and not in any document the executive suite had ever commissioned. She began to understand that the company's actual operational intelligence was distributed across people who had never attended a board meeting and never would, and that the reports she had been reading as CEO had been at best a translation of that intelligence into a language that management could process, and that something always disappeared in the translation. She thought about Graham Hayes, about the 7 years he had spent inside the company's actual machinery, the lunch hours at that diner, not as an act of modesty, but as a deliberate choice to stay close to the weight of real work. She understood now what that choice had cost him in terms of visibility, and what it had given him in terms of judgment. And she understood that the two things were not unrelated. 6 months after the shareholder meeting, Olivia returned to the Chicago headquarters and resumed her role as CEO. The company's credit position had stabilized. The debt restructuring through Caraway Capital had been completed on terms that the board's independent advisors described as unusually favorable to the company. Horizon Air Systems continued its supply chain coordination work across the company's maintenance network, quietly and without acknowledgement, the same way it always had. The audit had closed without material findings against the company's current leadership. Blake Donovan had been charged with securities fraud and wire fraud and was navigating a legal process that would occupy several years of his remaining professional life. The 4 investor representatives had reached civil settlements and been removed from any association with the company. Graham Hayes was not at the headquarters when Olivia returned. He had not been in the building since the night of the shareholder meeting. The Caraway Capital restructuring had been executed entirely through attorneys and the board's financial advisors, and Graham had communicated through those channels without appearing in any meeting, any call, or any corridor. His name appeared in the audit report in one place, in a single footnote, as the managing partner of Caraway Capital, whose cooperation had facilitated the company's debt resolution. It was the only formal record that connected him to the outcome. Somewhere, a Gulf Stream was moving through airspace at 43,000 feet, over a city whose name was not in any press release, carrying a man in dark slacks and a simple jacket, who had closed a document case, picked it up, and walked out of a room when the work was finished. He did not need the story to end with his name on anything. He never had. The engines of the aircraft above Fort Worth were audible most mornings, rolling across the tarmac, while the crew chiefs ran their checklists and the maintenance logs began another day. Olivia stood outside the facility one morning in her third week and listened to that sound, and she did not think about power or leverage or what a private jet said about the person inside it. She thought about all the hands that had touched that aircraft before it reached altitude, the mechanics who had certified it, the logistics coordinators who had sourced its parts, the schedulers who had cleared its path. She thought about how none of those people would ever be in a boardroom, and how the boardroom would be nothing without them. She went back inside. There was work to do, and she was finally learning how to do it.